In the small coal mining town of Aberdeen, New South Wales, the morning of February 29, 2000, dawned like any other. The sun rose over the Hunter Valley, casting long shadows across modest weatherboard houses where families were beginning their day. But inside number 84, St. Andrews Street, something unspeakable had occurred during the night. Something so profoundly disturbing that it would forever alter Australia's understanding of what one human being could do to another. John Charles Thomas Price was a father of 3, a well-liked member of the community, and a man who worked hard at the local abattoir. At 44 years old, he had finally found what he thought was stability after years of failed relationships. But stability, in this case, was an illusion. For the past 3 years, he had been entangled with Katherine Knight, a woman whose reputation for violence preceded her like a dark storm cloud. Born in October 1955 in Tenterfield, Katherine had grown up in a household marked by chaos and alleged abuse. Her mother had been married multiple times, and stories of domestic violence echoed through Katherine's childhood. She left school at 15, barely literate, and found work in the cutting rooms of local abattoirs, where she developed an unnerving proficiency with knives. Those who knew Katherine described her as someone capable of sudden, explosive rage. Her first husband, David Kellett, bore the scars of her temper, both physical and psychological. On their wedding night in 1974, she had reportedly tried to strangle him because the sex wasn't satisfactory. Years later, she would put his infant daughter on railway tracks, forcing him to rescue the child at the last possible moment. Her second de facto relationship with David Saunders produced a daughter, but ended when Katherine slashed the man's dog's throat in front of him and then struck him with a frying pan. The pattern was unmistakable. Katherine Knight did not simply argue or express displeasure. She erupted with calculated brutality. John Price knew all of this. His friends had warned him, begged him to stay away from her. Yet he had persisted, drawn perhaps by loneliness or by Katherine's occasional moments of warmth. But by early 2000, even John had reached his limit. On February 28, he made a decision that would seal his fate. He took out an apprehension order against Katherine, effectively banning her from his property. He told his co-workers at the abattoir that if he didn't show up for work the next day, it would be because Katherine had killed him. They laughed nervously, assuming it was dark humor. It wasn't. That evening, Katherine arrived at John's house despite the order. Witnesses would later report seeing her there, and what followed can only be pieced together from forensic evidence and the horrific crime scene that would be discovered the following morning. At some point during the night, while John Price slept in his bed, Katherine attacked him with a knife. He fought back. Blood spatter patterns would show that he staggered through his house, desperate to escape, his hands raised in defense as she struck him again and again. The medical examiner would later count at least 37 stab wounds across his body. But Katherine Knight did not stop when John Price died. What she did next went beyond murder, beyond rage, into territory that seemed impossible to comprehend. She skinned his body with the precision of someone who had spent decades working in abattoirs. She decapitated him. She cooked parts of his flesh with vegetables and potatoes, arranging the meals on plates intended for his children. She draped his skin, like a grotesque suit, across a chair in the lounge room. And then, as morning light began to filter through the windows of 84, St. Andrews Street, Katherine Knight sat down and waited. The first person to sense something was wrong was John Price's employer. When he failed to appear for his 6 a.m. shift at the abattoir on February 29th, alarm bells began ringing immediately. John was never late. He was the kind of man who prided himself on reliability, on being where he said he would be. His supervisor remembered the comment John had made just the day before, that chilling half-joke about Katherine Knight. It suddenly didn't seem funny at all. At approximately 8 a.m., a co-worker was dispatched to John's house to check on him. The man knocked on the door repeatedly, calling out John's name. There was no answer. The curtains were drawn, the house silent. Something felt deeply wrong. The coworker peered through windows, trying to see inside, but could make out nothing in the darkened interior. He returned to work and reported what he'd found, or rather, what he hadn't found. The decision was made to contact the police. Senior Constable Peter Muschio and his partner arrived at 84 St. Andrew Street just after 9 a.m. The front door was unlocked. Muschio pushed it open and immediately noticed the smell, thick and cloying, a mixture of cooked meat and something else he couldn't quite identify. He called out, identifying himself as police. No response. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light inside, he began to make out shapes in the lounge room. What he saw in those first few seconds would haunt him for the rest of his life. The skin suit draped over the chair. The severed head, positioned with Katherine's macabre sense of staging. Muschio backed out of the house immediately, his training overriding the shock that threatened to paralyze him. This was now a major crime scene. Within minutes, the street was cordoned off. Detective Senior Constable Bob Wells, who had 25 years of experience in the New South Wales police force, arrived to take command of the investigation. Wells had seen his share of violence, of domestic disputes turned fatal, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited inside that modest weatherboard house. As crime scene investigators began their methodical work, photographing every gruesome detail, the full scope of Katherine Knight's actions became apparent. The kitchen told its own horrifying story. Pots and pans contained human flesh cooked with root vegetables, as if Katherine had been preparing a Sunday roast. 2 plates were set at the dining table, each with a carefully arranged portion of John Price's remains, with name tags indicating they were meant for his adult children. Investigators found notes Katherine had written, incoherent ramblings that suggested she had planned to commit suicide after the children discovered what she had done. But she hadn't followed through. Instead, she had apparently overdosed on pills and was found unconscious in the bedroom, lying next to the bed where she had murdered John Price. Katherine Knight was transported to Maitland Hospital under police guard, where doctors worked to stabilize her condition. She remained in a semi-conscious state for hours, muttering incomprehensibly. Detective Wells knew he was dealing with something unprecedented in Australian criminal history. The brutality, the premeditation evident in the cooking and staging, the sheer calculated horror of it all. This wasn't a crime of passion in any conventional sense. This was something else entirely. By late afternoon on February 29th, news had begun to spread through Aberdeen. The town of fewer than 2,000 people was in collective shock. Everyone knew John Price. Many knew Katherine Knight, or at least knew of her reputation. Parents kept their children indoors. People gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, trying to process what had happened in their quiet community. The media descended within hours, satellite trucks lining the streets, reporters doing live crosses as the sun set over the Hunter Valley. In the following days, as Katherine regained consciousness, the question on everyone's mind was simple yet impossible to answer. Why? What could possibly drive a human being to such depths of depravity? Detectives began piecing together the timeline of February 28th and 29th, interviewing neighbors, examining Katherine's background, and building a case that would need to be airtight. The Crown prosecution would be seeking something rarely pursued in Australian courts, a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Forensic psychologists were brought in to evaluate Katherine Knight's mental state. Was this the act of someone legally insane, or was it premeditated murder followed by acts designed to cause maximum psychological harm to the victim's family? The evidence suggested the latter. Katherine had taken out the apprehension violence order herself earlier that day, playing the role of the frightened victim. She had gone to John's house knowing exactly what the order prohibited. She had brought her own knives, weapons she was intimately familiar with from her years working in slaughterhouses. And the cooking, the plating, the notes for the children, all of it spoke to a mind that was functioning, planning, executing a revenge so complete it would destroy not just John Price's life, but the lives of everyone who loved him. As March turned to April, and the investigation continued, Australia grappled with a question it had never truly confronted. What do you do with a woman capable of this? The committal hearing began on October 11, 2000, in the Maitland local court. Katherine Knight, now 44 years old, sat in the dock with an expression that observers described as blank, almost serene. She wore simple clothes, her hair pulled back, looking more like someone's grandmother than the monster the prosecution was preparing to reveal. The magistrate's task was straightforward: determine whether sufficient evidence existed to commit Knight to trial for murder. What unfolded over the following days left even experienced court officers shaken. The Crown's case was led by prosecutors who understood they were dealing with a crime unlike any other in Australian legal history. They presented the forensic evidence methodically. Crime scene photographs were shown to the magistrate in a closed session, deemed too disturbing for public viewing. Pathologist Dr. Timothy Lyons took the stand and described, in clinical detail, the 37 stab wounds John Price had sustained. He explained that the victim had been awake when the attack began, that he had fought desperately for his life, that the defensive wounds on his hands showed he had tried to protect himself. Death, Dr. Lyons estimated, had come perhaps 15 to 20 minutes into the assault, as blood loss finally overcame John's desperate will to survive. But it was what happened after death that truly distinguished this case. Dr. Lyons described how Katherine had used her expertise with knives, honed over decades in abattoirs, to skin John Price's body with disturbing precision. She had removed the skin in sections, carefully preserving it. The decapitation had been performed with skill. The butchering of the body, the removal of specific cuts of flesh, all of it demonstrated knowledge and capability. This wasn't frenzied mutilation. This was methodical, practiced work. Detective Bob Wells testified about the crime scene, about the plates set for John's children, about the notes Katherine had written. One note in particular stood out, a rambling letter that mixed grievances against John with expressions of love, accusations with apologies. Forensic psychologist Dr. Robert Delaforce explained that while Katherine had a personality disorder, she was not legally insane. She had known what she was doing was wrong. The elaborate staging, the attempt at suicide to avoid consequences, all pointed to someone aware of the gravity of their actions. On October 18, 2000, Katherine Knight was committed to stand trial in the New South Wales Supreme Court on charges of murder. She showed no emotion as she was led from the courtroom. Her legal team, understanding the hopelessness of their position, began discussing strategy. There could be no defense of the act itself. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. The only question was whether they could argue for diminished responsibility, perhaps avoiding the harshest possible sentence. The trial proper began on October 15, 2001, before Justice Barry O'Keefe in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. The proceedings were held in Newcastle, the nearest major city to Aberdeen. Security was extraordinarily tight. Katherine Knight had received death threats. The public gallery was packed each day with people desperate to understand how such evil could exist. Many were turned away. The courtroom simply couldn't accommodate everyone who wanted to bear witness. Katherine's defense team made a tactical decision that surprised many observers. On the second day of trial, October 16, Katherine Knight entered a plea of guilty to murder. It was an acknowledgement of reality. The evidence was simply insurmountable. But it also meant the trial would now focus entirely on sentencing, on whether Katherine would ever walk free again. In Australian law, even those convicted of murder typically receive a non-parole period, a date when they become eligible to apply for release. The prosecution was arguing that Katherine Knight should never be given that opportunity. Crown Prosecutor Mark Tedeschi QC stood before Justice O'Keefe and methodically laid out why this case demanded the most severe sentence available under Australian law. He detailed Katherine's history of violence, the warnings John Price had given, the deliberate violation of the apprehension order. He described the cooking of John's flesh, the plates prepared for his children, calling it an act designed to inflict psychological torture beyond the grave. This wasn't simply murder, Tedeschi argued. This was an attempt to destroy an entire family, to leave scars that would never heal. The defense called psychiatric experts who testified about Katherine's troubled childhood, about possible abuse she had suffered, about her limited intellectual capacity. They painted a picture of a woman damaged by circumstances, someone whose rage had built over decades until it finally erupted in catastrophic violence. But even these sympathetic portrayals couldn't erase what Katherine had done. The experts acknowledged she had been capable of understanding right from wrong, that her actions showed planning and deliberation. John Price's family gave victim impact statements that left the courtroom in tears. His daughter described nightmares about the meals her father's killer had prepared for her, about the knowledge that she had been intended to discover them. His son spoke of the father he had lost, a man who had simply wanted to end a toxic relationship and move on with his life. The psychological devastation Katherine had inflicted extended far beyond her victim, rippling out through an entire community. On October 29, 2001, Justice O'Keefe delivered his sentence. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as he spoke. He described Katherine Knight's actions as almost beyond contemplation in a civilized society, noting that the cooking and intended serving of John Price's flesh to his children represented a defilement of the victim's body that was breathtaking in its malignancy. And then he handed down a sentence that made legal history. Katherine Mary Knight was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She became the first woman in Australian history to receive such a sentence. There would be no parole hearing, no chance for rehabilitation programs to earn her freedom, no distant hope of release. Katherine Knight would die in prison. Justice O'Keefe made it clear that some acts are so heinous, so completely beyond the pale of human decency, that they forfeit any claim to eventual mercy. Katherine showed no reaction as the sentence was read. She was led from the courtroom to begin a life that would be measured in concrete walls and locked doors, in endless identical days stretching toward an inevitable death behind bars. Katherine Mary Knight was transported to the Silverwater Women's Correctional Center in Sydney, where she would spend the remainder of her days. The prison, a sprawling complex of high-security units, became her entire world. Her cell measured roughly 3 meters by 2, containing a bed, a toilet, a small desk. This would be the extent of her domain for decades to come. Prison officials noted that she adapted to the routine with unsettling ease, as if the structure and confinement suited her. She worked in the prison laundry, ate her meals in silence, and rarely spoke to other inmates. Those who did interact with her reported that she showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the enormity of what she had done. In the years following her conviction, Katherine made several appeals against her sentence. In 2006, she challenged the life without parole order, arguing through her lawyers that it was excessive, that she deserved at least the possibility of eventual release. The appeal was heard by 3 judges of the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal. They reviewed the case thoroughly, re-examining the evidence, the psychiatric reports, the circumstances of the crime. On August 12, 2006, they handed down their decision. The appeal was dismissed. The judges agreed unanimously that Justice O'Keefe's original sentence was not only appropriate but necessary. The judgment noted that Katherine's crime involved a horrifying malignancy rarely seen, and that the community needed protection from her in perpetuity. Katherine tried again in 2018, this time arguing that advances in understanding of domestic violence and trauma should be considered. Her legal team presented new psychological evaluations suggesting she had been a victim herself, shaped by years of abuse and dysfunction. But once more, the courts rejected her appeal. The New South Wales Court of Appeal found that while Katherine's background was indeed troubled, it did not excuse or sufficiently explain the calculated brutality of her actions. The cooking of John Price's flesh, the meals prepared for his children, these acts went beyond any recognized pattern of domestic violence response. They represented something darker, something that required permanent removal from society. The case of Katherine Knight left deep scars on the Australian psyche. Aberdeen, the small town where the murder occurred, struggled for years with its unwanted notoriety. Property values on St. Andrews Street plummeted. Number 84, the house where John Price died, stood empty for months before finally being demolished. Residents spoke of wanting to erase the physical reminder of what had happened, though they knew the psychological wounds would take far longer to heal. John Price's children, now adults with families of their own, have lived with the knowledge of what was intended for them, the grotesque meals their father's killer had prepared. In interviews given years later, they described ongoing therapy, nightmares that never fully disappeared, and the struggle to explain to their own children why they could never know their grandfather. The case also sparked serious conversations within Australia's legal and social services communities. How had Katherine Knight's pattern of violence been allowed to continue unchecked for so long? Her first husband had endured strangulation attempts and threats. Her second partner had seen her kill his dog and assault him. Friends and family of John Price had warned him repeatedly about Katherine's dangerous nature. Yet no intervention had occurred that might have prevented the tragedy. In the aftermath, New South Wales strengthened its domestic violence protocols, improved training for police officers responding to apprehension order violations, and created better systems for tracking individuals with histories of extreme violence. Criminologists and forensic psychologists continue to study the Katherine Knight case as an extreme example of female-perpetrated violence. Dr. Zan the Mallet, a renowned forensic criminologist at the University of Newcastle, has noted that while women commit far fewer violent crimes than men, when they do engage in extreme violence, it often involves intimate partners and can display levels of brutality that challenge common assumptions about gendered patterns of crime. Katherine Knight's actions, particularly the post-mortem mutilation and cooking, represent what Dr. Mallet terms performative violence. Acts designed not just to kill but to send a message, to inflict maximum psychological damage on survivors. The question of whether Katherine Knight is fundamentally different from other violent offenders, or simply further along a continuum of domestic violence, remains debated. Some experts argue she exhibits psychopathic traits, a complete lack of empathy combined with a capacity for instrumental violence. Others suggest she represents an extreme trauma response, decades of abuse and dysfunction culminating in an explosive, catastrophic act. What remains undisputed is the calculation evident in her actions. This wasn't a moment of lost control. Katherine had time to skin, butcher, cook, and stage. She made choices at every step. Today, Katherine Mary Knight is in her late 60s, still incarcerated at Silverwater. Prison staff report that she has aged like any other inmate, her hair gone gray, her movements slower. She receives no visitors, her own family having long since severed contact. She spends her days in the prison library, in the exercise yard, in her cell. The other inmates largely avoid her, aware of what she did, disturbed by the casual way she discusses it when she does speak of it at all. In 2019, a prison psychologist's report noted that Katherine still maintains John Price deserved what he got, that she was justified in her actions because he had tried to end their relationship. The victims of Katherine Knight's crime extend far beyond John Price himself. His children carry scars that will never fully heal. His friends live with guilt, wondering if they could have done more to protect him. The police officers and crime scene investigators who processed that house on February 29, 2000, have spoken publicly about the ongoing psychological impact, the images they can never unsee, the nightmares that still visit them decades later. Aberdeen lost its innocence, its sense of being a quiet country town where such horrors simply didn't happen. And Australia itself was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth, that evil doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Katherine Knight wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. She was a mother, a grandmother, someone's partner. She worked a regular job, lived in a normal house, looked utterly unremarkable. The banality of her appearance made the extremity of her actions all the more disturbing. If Katherine Knight could be capable of such depravity, who else might be? As the years pass and Katherine Knight ages toward death in prison, her case stands as a permanent marker in Australian criminal history. She remains the only woman ever sentenced to life without parole in the country, a distinction born from an act so horrifying it demanded a response without precedent. When she dies, likely within the concrete walls of Silverwater, there will be no public mourning, no remembrance beyond the clinical recording of her passing in prison records. But John Charles Thomas Price will be remembered. By his children, who continue to honor his memory. By his friends, who gather each year on the anniversary of his death. By a community that learned too late the danger that had lived among them. And by a nation that will never forget the morning of February 29, 2000, when Australia discovered just how dark the human heart could become. The case file remains open at the New South Wales Police Archives, a testament to one of the most disturbing crimes in the nation's history. Katherine Knight will die in prison. But the questions her actions raised about violence, about warning signs ignored, about how we protect the vulnerable, those questions continue to echo through Australia's consciousness, demanding answers we are still struggling to find.